He was a billionaire CEO with a perfect life on paper, but not a single ounce of warmth left in his heart. She was just his assistant, calm, competent, and almost invisible. Until one morning, she changed her perfume. It was just a scent, soft, subtle, but it shattered something in him. Why did that fragrance of all things haunt a man who had buried love years ago? Why did she, a woman who never asked to be seen, suddenly feel like the only person who ever truly looked into him? What happens when two people, broken in completely different ways, slowly orbit the one thing they're both terrified of? Connection. This is not a love story that shouts. It's the kind that lingers quietly, like a scent in an empty room, familiar, aching, undeniable. So, why couldn't he forget her? And why did she almost walk away, just when he was ready to choose her? Let's begin the story of Jonathan and Claire, a story of scent, silence, and the soft, stubborn hope that sometimes returns when we finally stop pushing it away. If this kind of story touches something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. He noticed it the moment she walked in, but he said nothing. That new scent, soft and unexpected, wrapped around him like a memory. And yet, he told himself it was nothing, just perfume. It was a quiet Thursday morning in Charleston, the kind of morning that felt more like a gentle exhale than a beginning. The sky stretched in soft layers of pewter and pearl, and a crispness floated in the air that hinted, without ceremony, that summer had finally given in to fall. From his office window on the 14th floor, Jonathan Whitaker looked out over the sleepy city, the harbor barely stirring, the church steeples unmoved by time, the cobblestone streets slowly waking beneath drifting leaves. His office, by contrast, had long been awake. Everything had a place: the chair, the desk, the untouched leather-bound planner, the wall clock that ticked with the same precision he demanded of his own schedule. It was the kind of space that welcomed no surprises, not even the comforting kind. And yet, one came. Claire Bennett entered at exactly 8:01. As always, she moved like she always did, quiet, steady, respectful of space, a slate blue blouse, dark trousers, low heels, hair pulled into the same simple twist she wore every day. Nothing new, nothing loud, but something had shifted. It arrived before her voice, before the soft click of the door or the rustle of paper in her hands. It was a scent, a subtle whisper in the air. Jonathan didn't look up right away, though he felt the change immediately. It brushed against him with quiet insistence. Warm, floral, maybe vanilla or sandalwood. He couldn't place it, but it wasn't artificial. It smelled lived in, like the inside of a sweater that had known one too many rainy afternoons, like memory. She stepped closer to set the folder on his desk. As she did, the scent seemed to breathe across the room and curl into the space between them. He caught it fully, then soft but persistent, like it belonged to something older than perfume. Claire said something about the board meeting timing, agenda, slides to finalize. He heard the words, but they floated past him like leaves on a stream. He nodded, made a note he wouldn't remember writing, and let her walk out. And still, the scent stayed. The door clicked closed behind her, and Jonathan remained motionless for a moment too long. His fingers paused above his keyboard. The cursor blinked. His coffee sat untouched, losing heat by the minute. He told himself to move on, to focus. He prided himself on that, the ability to compartmentalize, to file away distractions like invoices in a locked drawer. But this wasn't a distraction. Not exactly. It was something quieter, older, something that called to a part of him that he thought had long gone quiet. By tender dawn, he had reread the same paragraph in the financial report 3 times. By noon, he found himself lingering too long near the break room door, listening to the rhythm of her voice in the hallway. And by mid-afternoon, during the board meeting with 5 division heads and a visiting investor, he completely missed a question directed at him. That had never happened before. He recovered quickly, no one called him out. But he knew, and worse, he knew why. He hadn't seen her since that morning. She hadn't returned to his office. There was no reason for her to. The documents were clear, the agenda set. Still, he had half expected some excuse, a quick update, a forgotten form. But she didn't come back, and that absence gnawed. The scent, however, lingered. It had become part of the air, clinging to the fibers of his mind, and with it came an unease. Not of desire, that word felt too crude, but of disruption. Something had stirred beneath the surface of his carefully structured world, and it rattled him in ways he couldn't admit out loud. He tried to trace the memory it stirred, but it wasn't specific. Not a date, not a person, just a feeling. The way light slanted through an old kitchen window in late October. The echo of laughter in a house that no longer stood. A scarf left on the back of a chair. He didn't think of Elizabeth, not directly. That name lived in a separate room inside him, always locked, always quiet, but the scent, it knocked. By the end of the day, Jonathan felt oddly fatigued, not from tasks those he had completed, if more slowly than usual, but from being pulled inward all day. Like he'd been resisting a current without knowing he was in water. He left the office later than he meant to. Claire's desk was already empty, her chair tucked in, her lamp off, no sweater left behind, no note, just space. The elevator ride was silent. His car smelled like leather and faint traces of pine from the dry cleaner's hanger in the back seat. But underneath it, somehow, was a breath of something warmer. He shook his head once, as if trying to clear it like fog from a windshield. Later, at home, he changed out of his dress shirt, tossing it over the back of a chair. As he passed by, he caught it again. That same scent, embedded now in the collar, not strong, but real. He stopped, closed his eyes, and let himself remember. Not a person, not a moment, just a feeling. A pull towards something that felt like life complicated, beautiful, uninvited, something he had locked away long ago for the sake of peace, for the sake of control. He opened his eyes and walked to the sink, washed his hands twice, then stood staring at his own reflection in the kitchen window as night bled quietly into the garden outside. The scent wasn't gone, not from the shirt, not from the air, and not from the place inside him that had dared to wake up again. That night, long after the office lights dimmed and the streets below emptied, he still smelled it in his mind, in his memory, and he hated how much he wanted to. Jonathan Whitaker didn't believe in accidents. Everything in his life had a place, everything, until that scent disrupted his world. For as long as he could remember, order had been Jonathan's anchor, not the obsessive kind, though his sister used to tease him for alphabetizing his books even as a teenager. No, his was the quiet, controlled discipline of someone who had known chaos and vowed never to let it in again. His house, a stately Georgian-style home nestled near the Ashley River, stood in proud silence just a few miles from downtown Charleston. The structure was old early 1900s, with crown moldings and wide planked floors, but immaculately maintained. It held the kind of history he respected, solid bones, no surprises. Each morning followed the same rhythm. He rose at 5, ran exactly 4 miles along the shaded trail behind his property, drank black coffee from the same ceramic mug, and arrived at his office by 7:30. The mug had a small chip on the handle. He never replaced it. He liked things that stayed. His home office was in the library room, floor-to-ceiling shelves, dark walnut panels, the scent of leather-bound volumes still faintly present. He rarely read the books anymore, but they were there, like old friends who didn't require conversation. The space had once belonged to his father, then to his wife Elizabeth after her passing. When she died, he moved in not because he needed the space, but because he couldn't bear to see it empty. 7 years had passed since then. The furniture hadn't moved, at work. The design of his executive suite mirrored that same muted control. His desk was always clear except for a monitor, a legal pad, and a silver pen that never rolled because he kept a small leather ridge at the edge of the desk. His assistant, Claire, knew better than to bring in coffee without a lid or leave documents stacked instead of aligned. She didn't take offense. In fact, she seemed to appreciate the structure. She had her own quiet kind of order, efficient, composed, unobtrusive. That was part of why he had hired her 5 years ago. That, and her ability to handle difficult situations without ever raising her voice. What he hadn't expected at the time was that she had once worked as the ICU nurse manager at Memorial Medical downtown. When they met, she was in the process of transitioning into administrative roles after her divorce, looking for something steadier. She'd said in her interview, not easier, just different. He respected that. He respected her. He had, over time, grown to rely on her presence the way one relies on a clock, steady, faithful, never demanding to be noticed, but deeply missed when absent. Still, in all those years, he had never once let himself see her as a woman. Until now, it wasn't intentional. In fact, he tried very hard to keep things professional, especially after what that scent had done to him the day before. But the mind has its own agendas, and the body follows even more stubbornly. That morning, Claire stepped into his office with the same quiet grace, holding a briefing folder for a philanthropic board he chaired. Her blouse was ivory, tucked neatly into a charcoal skirt, and her hair was loosely swept up, perhaps a little more relaxed than usual. He didn't look long, just a glance. But that was all it took. She handed him the folder and leaned slightly over his desk to point out a note. In doing so, a strand of hair fell forward, grazing her neck, and for the first time, his eyes followed that motion down the curve of her jaw to the hollow just beneath her ear. There, barely visible above her collar, was a single freckle. His fingers twitched. He didn't move, didn't speak. But in that second, 1,000 thoughts rose like dust in a beam of light. How close she was, how warm the room suddenly felt, how easily a person could reach out and what might happen if they did. He looked away, sharply, almost too sharply. Claire, unaware, straightened and waited for his approval of the agenda. He nodded, keeping his eyes on the folder. She said nothing more, only turned and left, the door closing with the same soft click it always did. The air in the room seemed too still after she left, too empty. Jonathan stood, walked to the window, and tried to slow his breathing. It was absurd, he told himself, nonsensical, dangerous. Even, these kinds of feelings, this pull, they were nothing more than echoes. Biology, habit, memory. And yet, the ghost of that freckle stayed in his mind all day, as did the thought of what it would feel like just once to brush that strand of hair back into place. He hated himself for wondering. That evening, he returned home later than usual. The sun had dipped below the marshes, leaving the sky streaked with pink and indigo. Inside the house, silence waited faithfully. No television, no music, just the occasional creak of the old wood floor beneath his steps. He poured himself a glass of water, not wine, not tonight, and stood in the kitchen, unsure what to do with the weight inside his chest. He walked into the study and sat in the same armchair Elizabeth used to love. The leather was worn, smooth at the edges, and still held the faintest trace of her old lavender sachets. Though he hadn't replaced them in years, his suit jacket was draped across the ottoman. Absent-mindedly, he picked it up and brought it to his lap, and then he froze. The scent was there, not faint this time, not imagined, real, embedded in the fabric near the cuff, where Claire's hand had brushed it as she handed him the folder. It was different from yesterday's ghost of a fragrance. This was immediate, alive. He brought the fabric closer, reluctantly, cautiously. The scent met him halfway, soft, floral, deepened by warmth and the faintest hint of something earthy. He closed his eyes, and there it was again. Not Elizabeth, not quite. Something else, something new. Not love, not yet. But the beginning of something he didn't have a name for. Something he didn't trust, but couldn't deny. A presence, a possibility, a quiet rebellion against the life of silence he had built so carefully around himself. The bottle wasn't expensive. It sat quietly between a modest moisturizer and a cracked ceramic dish of earrings on Claire's vanity. Small, rounded edges, frosted glass. The label had worn thin in places, though she liked it better that way, less polished, more real. The scent inside was a blend of white florals and something deeper sandalwood, maybe a soft touch of vanilla, warm without being loud. She had bought it 3 weeks ago, on a Wednesday. It had been raining that day, a steady Charleston drizzle that painted the sidewalks in reflections and slowed the city to a kind of hush. Claire had just stepped out of the dry cleaners when the scent caught her. It drifted from the open door of a boutique she'd never noticed before, one of those small, tucked-away shops with soft jazz playing inside and little handwritten price tags on everything. She almost didn't go in, but something in her restless, wordless nudged her forward. There was no sales pitch, no special offer. Just a middle-aged woman with silver hair and kind eyes who offered her a test strip and said, "It's subtle, but it lingers." Claire brought it to her nose and paused. It was gentle, but grounding, not sharp, not sugary, like the warmth of a favorite scarf pulled close to the skin, or the faint sweetness that clings to the last page of a letter tucked away too long. She bought it without thinking. No plan, no occasion, just a quiet want. Claire had never been the kind of woman who wore fragrance every day. In the ICU, strong scents were discouraged, and after the divorce, she didn't feel much like being noticed. Her clothes were simple, her voice steady, her presence intentional but small. As Jonathan's assistant, she had learned to blend in, move efficiently, speak clearly, keep her emotions folded neatly away like backup copies in a locked drawer. But lately, she'd started feeling like she was disappearing, not in a dramatic sense, just slowly, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. She didn't want to be anyone's fantasy, or some grand reveal. She just wanted to feel visible again, to herself, if not to anyone else. That's why she wore the scent, not every day, just sometimes, like that morning. It had started out like any other Thursday. Calendar reviews, vendor updates, a pre-meeting with the legal team, everything where it should be. Jonathan had been his usual self, precise, quiet, polite. If he noticed anything different, he didn't say, he never did. But Claire caught something that afternoon in the boardroom. The team was deep into discussions, budget reallocations, new construction timelines. Claire sat 2 seats to Jonathan's right, monitoring the presentation slides and adjusting notes as needed. At one point, he reached for a printed packet, and she leaned forward to hand it to him, an automatic movement, practiced and seamless. But just before her hand pulled back, he tilted his head ever so slightly. Not a full turn, just a gentle inclination, barely perceptible to anyone else, as if he was inhaling. And for a fraction of a second, Claire froze. Her heart fluttered not in the way novels described, but like the faint stutter of a skipped beat. That involuntary breath the body takes when something private becomes suddenly shared. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. The moment passed. The meeting continued. But something had shifted. Later that afternoon, she found herself rearranging files in the storage cabinet longer than necessary. The room was quiet, save for the distant murmur of conversations and the steady hum of the building's climate system. She wondered if she'd imagined it. Maybe he'd simply adjusted his posture. Maybe he hadn't noticed anything at all. Jonathan was meticulous, respectful, private to a fault. He didn't let emotion guide him. She admired that, in a way. Still, there had been something in that breath. Not hunger, not interest, even just awareness. And for someone like Claire, that was more intimate than touch. It wasn't validation she wanted. It wasn't attention. It was to be seen, not as a function, not as a name on a schedule, but as a woman still capable of change, still alive beneath the layers of routine and restraint. That night, after a slow drive home and a dinner she only half finished, Claire stepped into her bedroom and paused by the mirror. The day had settled into her shoulders, quiet and unspoken. She picked up the bottle, didn't spray it, just held it. She thought of how far she'd come since the divorce, how the silence in her apartment no longer scared her, how she'd built a rhythm of her own. She thought of her job, the structure she appreciated, the respect she'd earned, and she thought of the moment in the boardroom. So small, so quiet, but real. Claire placed the perfume bottle back on the vanity. She didn't spray it, but its presence was enough. He started avoiding her reflection before he realized he was avoiding her. At first, it was subtle, a shift in his walking pattern, a pause by the water cooler instead of the direct route to the conference room, a decision to review a file from his tablet instead of picking it up from Claire's desk. Jonathan didn't label these changes. He was too practiced at compartmentalization to admit such things to himself, but his feet knew before his mind did. Something in him was turning. He'd glance toward her desk in the morning, see the curve of her shoulders as she typed, the gentle arc of her wrist as she wrote notes by hand, and then he'd look away. The scent hadn't returned, not since that last meeting, but its memory remained, stubborn and lingering, tucked into corners of his thoughts like dust in an unopened drawer. Avoidance wasn't his nature. He was decisive, focused, but this, whatever this was, it disrupted that rhythm. Claire hadn't done anything wrong. She was the same efficient, respectful, gracious without overreaching. Her presence hadn't changed. Only his reaction to it had. That was the problem. Claire, for her part, noticed the distance. It wasn't dramatic, no coldness, no clipped words. Jonathan was still polite, still responsive, but the subtleties were different. He no longer handed her his coffee mug in the afternoons. He didn't pause after meetings to ask her thoughts, the way he sometimes used to. His eye contact, always brief, had grown briefer. She didn't take it personally, or at least she tried not to. But somewhere, a small ache formed, not the kind that demanded attention, just a quiet awareness like an old coat that fit differently one day without explanation. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe he was under pressure. Maybe the board was on him again about expansion budgets. Maybe she was imagining things. And yet, when she passed him in the hallway and he looked past her instead of at her, she felt it, like standing in sunlight and suddenly stepping into shade. The week dragged on, each day slower than the last. On Wednesday, Jonathan stood at the window of his glass office while rain tapped gently against the panes. Down below, Claire was crossing the lobby with a printed folder in hand, walking beside one of the newer project coordinators, a young man, fresh out of grad school, always smiling too easily. Claire laughed at something he said, not loudly, just a quick, genuine moment of amusement that lit her face in a way Jonathan hadn't seen in a while. He watched, just for a second, then turned away, immediately ashamed of the pang in his chest. Jealousy wasn't a word he allowed. It didn't fit the version of himself he'd worked so hard to maintain. He wasn't interested. He wasn't attached. It was simply unfamiliar. That was all. Still, he didn't look out the window again that day. Later that afternoon, the elevator ride from the boardroom down to the main lobby felt unusually long. Jonathan stepped in just as the doors were closing, only to see Claire already standing inside. She offered a small nod, then faced forward. He mirrored her. They stood side by side, not touching, not speaking, but the silence was thick, pressed in. Jonathan could feel the heat of her sleeve near his wrist, though there was at least 3 inches of air between them. The faint scent of something clean soap, not perfume, rose from her hair. He told himself not to notice, but it was too late. The descent began. 1 floor, 2. The air inside the elevator had weight. He heard the soft intake of her breath, not sharp, just steady, but it curled around his nerves like a question with no voice. He almost spoke, almost asked if she was all right, almost apologized for something he hadn't defined. Instead, he stayed still, both feet grounded, hands folded before him. When the doors opened at the lobby, they exited together without a word. That evening, Jonathan stayed later than usual. The office had emptied, save for a few cleaning staff. The stillness gave him space, but not peace. He stood by his desk, staring at Claire's name printed neatly on a schedule note she'd left behind. He considered calling her in, just to ask, just to say, "That's sent. What is it?" But the question caught in his throat and stayed there. What would that imply? That he noticed, that he remembered, that he cared. He erased the thought like a smudge on glass. Instead, he walked to the window, looked at the shimmer of lights across the river, and tried not to let his chest tighten. The rain came fast that evening, just as the lights flickered in the little inn by the marsh. They had arrived in Savannah just before sunset. The sky had already begun to shift clouds swelling over the horizon, dark with the promise of a storm. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. The meeting had gone well. A potential investor from New England, polite and optimistic, seemed eager to partner with Whitaker Medical Holdings. Jonathan had spoken in his usual steady cadence, Claire by his side with documents, notes, and clarifications that landed with quiet precision. She always knew when to speak and when to stay silent. But it wasn't the meeting he remembered that night. It was the inn, not a hotel, an inn, old-fashioned, with wooden shutters, creaky floorboards, and the faint scent of dried lavender in the hallway. It sat right by the marsh, tucked between oak trees heavy with moss, and had only 8 guest rooms. Jonathan had picked it for its proximity to the meeting location, not for charm, but there was charm, whether he wanted it or not. Their rooms were side by side, number 4 and number 5. Claire had smiled softly when she saw the brass keys, not electronic cards, handed to them at the front desk. She liked that. He noticed, by 9:00 p.m., the storm broke. Lightning cracked across the marshland sky like threads of silver snapped too tight. Rain pelted the windows, and the lights flickered once, twice, then went out. Jonathan had just finished brushing his teeth when the room plunged into darkness. The air felt still, save for the sound of wind threading through the shutters. For a long moment, he stood quietly by the bed, letting his eyes adjust. He thought of calling the front desk, but didn't move. Then 3 soft knocks. He opened the door to find Claire, wrapped in a light cardigan, holding a ceramic mug in both hands. A single candle flickered behind her in the hallway. "I brought ginger tea," she said, almost as if unsure if it was allowed. He hesitated, not because of the offer, but because of the feeling behind it, that quiet intimacy, the kind that comes not from romance, but from memory, from something older, deeper, care. She stepped in without waiting for permission, not out of confidence, but out of instinct. The nurse in her, perhaps. She placed the tea on the small table by the window, where a candle had already been lit by the innkeeper. The soft orange glow painted shadows across the walls, making the space feel smaller, closer. "Looks like the power's out for a while," she said, settling into the armchair. Jonathan sat across from her, the mug warm in his hands. Though he hadn't taken a sip yet, for a moment, neither spoke. Just the rain. Then, slowly, the conversation began quiet, halting, like a creek finding its path through new stones. They spoke of work first, budgets, staff morale, expansion plans. Then came smaller things, her favorite season autumn, his favorite book he didn't say, but she guessed it right. The Old Man and the Sea. The conversation was safe, familiar, but eventually, inevitably, it turned to the past. He told her about Elizabeth, not in long, emotional detail. Jonathan didn't do that. But he spoke of the illness, the silence in the house after, the months where even the sound of footsteps on the floor felt like betrayal. Claire didn't fill the quiet that followed. She simply sat, one hand wrapped around her mug, the other resting loosely in her lap. Then she spoke about the divorce, the nights she spent folding laundry on the floor because she couldn't bear the bed, the way her ex-husband never raised his voice, but made her feel smaller by simply looking past her. Jonathan listened, really listened, and when she paused, He didn't interject. He just waited. That's when she said it. Not dramatically, not with tears. "Sometimes I think I wore that new perfume," she said, voice low, not to be noticed by anyone in particular, but to remind myself I could be, that I was still here. Jonathan said nothing at first. He stared at the candle between them, at the wax pooling near the base. When he finally looked up, his eyes met hers and held. The room felt warmer, not from heat, but from presence. "I noticed," he said. Quiet, honest. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. "I noticed, and I haven't stopped thinking about it. Or you." His voice didn't tremble, but his chest did. He hadn't meant to say it, not out loud, not like that. But there it was, suspended between them, like a thread stretched just tight enough to hum. Claire didn't move, she didn't smile, but she didn't look away either, and that said everything. She didn't reject him, but she also didn't reach across the table. Instead, she let the silence stretch, not cold, not distant, just full, thick with the weight of something real, something forming. The storm outside had softened to a steady rain, a hush beneath the louder storm still brewing quietly inside them both. The sun rose slowly over the marsh, casting the inn's wooden floors in long, pale rectangles. Light filtered through gauzy curtains, and the room felt still not empty, not full, just paused, like the breath between thoughts. Jonathan opened his eyes to find the world unchanged. The storm had passed. The power had returned. The clock beside the bed blinked quietly, 47A. Awesome. He sat up, feeling the faint stiffness in his back that mornings often brought now. The kind of stiffness that came not from age, but from holding too much in too long. His suit jacket was still draped over the armchair. The teacup from last night sat empty on the table. The candle had long since burned out, leaving only a pool of hardened wax in its base. And Claire's presence, though she had left hours ago, lingered. Not physically. No scent remained. No imprint on the cushion. But the space between their chairs still held the weight of everything that wasn't said. He washed up, dressed slowly, and buttoned his cuffs with unusual care. There was nothing remarkable about the morning, and yet, everything had changed. Claire had already checked out when he came downstairs. She was standing by the inn's small front desk, sliding a key across the counter, her posture composed, her hair pinned up in a loose twist that revealed the soft line of her neck. She turned at the sound of the creaky stairwell, offered him a small nod, professional, almost distant. He nodded back. Neither mentioned the tea, the candle, the words. But Jonathan noticed the faint tremble in her hand as she reached for her phone, and Claire noticed the way he didn't meet her eyes for more than a second. They rode to the meeting in silence. The investor meeting went smoothly. Remarkably so. Contracts were reviewed, numbers confirmed, handshakes exchanged. The room hummed with the quiet energy of deals being made and futures being shaped. Jonathan spoke with his usual clarity and confidence, every syllable measured. Claire took notes, filled in gaps, caught a typo on the presentation slide before anyone else noticed. They worked together, seamlessly. And yet, between the lines of dialogue, between the shuffle of papers and polite laughter, something else pulsed beneath the surface, a tension not loud enough to interrupt, but impossible to ignore. At one point, Jonathan passed her a fresh copy of the summary page. Their fingers didn't touch, but they came close. And when she adjusted the cuff of his sleeve just before the client walked in, he inhaled slightly, just enough for her to feel it. It wasn't the moment from last night, but it echoed. By afternoon, the paperwork was done. The investor had signed a preliminary memorandum. Celebration was implied. Though no one suggested champagne, Claire didn't stay for coffee. She packed the briefcase, thanked the receptionist, and stepped outside alone to wait for the car. The Savannah air was warmer now, heavy with the scent of wet wood and sunlit grass. Across the street, a group of tourists passed by laughing, their sandals slapping wet pavement, oblivious to the lives unraveling in quieter corners of the city. Claire stood still, hands clasped in front of her, and tried to still her own pulse. Because it wasn't just the night before. It was everything after. The way he didn't bring it up. The way she didn't either. The shared silence that had once felt comforting now hung between them like fog refusing to lift. She returned to the inn lobby for just a moment, said she'd forgotten her scarf. She hadn't. She just needed to breathe somewhere small and quiet. In the reading nook near the window, there was a wooden writing desk with an old brass lamp. She sat there and opened her email on her phone. Her thumb hovered over the compose button. She didn't think. She just wrote, subject line, for my own peace, body still empty. She stared at the screen. Her reflection ghosted faintly in the glass. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't impulsive. It was survival, because she knew, somewhere deep in her, that if she stayed, if she let herself live in this liminal space between not yet and maybe she'd lose herself again, slowly, gently, but completely. She wasn't angry. She didn't blame him, but she couldn't ignore the ache of almost. Outside, the sun glinted off the still waters of the marsh. A crane dipped its beak into the reeds. The wind had stilled. The storm had passed, but the silence between them hadn't. Not really. Claire locked her phone. The draft stayed in her inbox unsent, but real. She didn't delete it, didn't close the app. She just sat there, watching sunlight catch on ripples, and wondered, had he felt it too? Or was she just a story she told herself? The hardest words to write are the ones you never intend to send, but sometimes, just typing them helps you breathe. Claire returned to Charleston on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky washed in pale gold and the air tinged with the scent of pine from nearby yards. The car ride from Savannah had been uneventful. The city welcomed her back with its quiet streets and familiar turns. But something inside her remained adrift. At home, she unpacked quickly, folded her clothes into drawers, washed her travel mug, lit the lavender candle by the window like she always did after being away. These things grounded her, but the weight in her chest remained unmoved. That night, she opened the drafts folder on her phone. The email was still there. Subject for my own peace. She read it again. The body was still blank. She didn't add to it, didn't delete it. She just looked at it, then moved it into a separate folder labeled Personal, hidden between old grocery lists and travel itineraries. It was safe there, out of sight, but not forgotten. The next morning, Claire walked into Whitaker Medical Holdings with the same calm composure she always carried. Her blouse was pale blue, her steps measured, her voice even, but something had shifted. She noticed it first in the way Jonathan greeted her. He didn't stop walking when he saw her, just offered a faint nod and kept moving. No comment about the trip, no mention of the investor, not even a thank you for her flawless coordination. It was small, so small, but she felt it. As the hours passed, the pattern repeated. His glances were shorter, his instructions clipped. He chose to email her instead of walking to her desk. Claire didn't ask why, but with every passing interaction, she felt herself receding like a photograph left on a windowsill too long, the colors slowly fading, the shape still there, but less vivid. She had once felt seen. Now, she felt translucent. By Thursday, the silence between them had calcified into something harder. She began leaving earlier, ate lunch at her desk instead of in the courtyard, avoided the hallway by his office, not to punish him, just to preserve herself. She needed to breathe somewhere else. So, that Saturday, Claire drove to the outskirts of the city about 20 minutes west to a small assisted living facility she used to volunteer at during her nursing days. The building hadn't changed: red brick, white shutters, hanging ferns by the entrance. She asked for the director, an older woman named Ms. Evelyn she hadn't seen in years. They hugged. It was warm, familiar. "I don't know what I'm looking for," Claire admitted quietly. fingers wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea in the small office. But I miss being around people who don't expect me to be perfect. Evelyn smiled with the softness of someone who'd heard that kind of confession before. We always need hands and hearts. Claire nodded. I'm not making any promises, just exploring. Sometimes that's where the most honest decisions begin. Later that afternoon, as she was walking through the common area, a resident with thinning silver hair and distant eyes reached out and gently touched her hand. Elizabeth, the woman asked, her voice hopeful, trembling. Claire froze. The name hung between them. For a moment, Claire didn't move. Her breath caught somewhere high in her chest. She felt the weight of it, not just the coincidence, but the history that name carried. She crouched gently beside the woman, her voice calm. No, sweetie, my name's Claire. I'm just visiting today. The woman's eyes searched hers, uncertain. Then slowly, she nodded, patted Claire's hand, and leaned back into her chair. Claire stood quietly, trying not to show the tremor in her hands. That night, in her apartment, she sat cross-legged on her bed with her journal open. The lamp beside her cast a warm glow over the pages. The windows were cracked slightly, and the sound of cicadas filtered in from the trees outside. She took out a pen, wrote slowly. Sometimes I wonder if what we shared was real, or if I just needed something to fill the space where hope used to be. But you said my name like it mattered, and I haven't forgotten how that felt. She didn't sign it, didn't date it, but folded the page carefully and tucked it into the inside flap of her journal, between a grocery receipt and a photo of her and her sister at Folly Beach. Then, she opened her phone, navigated to her personal folder, and deleted the draft email. Not because she no longer needed it, but because some truths are better written in ink. He hadn't smelled it in days, and now that it was gone, it haunted him more than ever. Jonathan Whitaker wasn't one to chase ghosts. He kept his life-precise files labeled, days timed, meetings stacked like dominoes with no room for tilt or sway. Emotions, when they came, were filed neatly away in corners no one could access, not even himself. But lately, the silence had changed shape. It used to comfort him, the quiet mornings in his glass-walled office, the muted click of his keyboard, the steady hum of Charleston traffic beyond the window. He had built his life on solitude, protected it like a fortress. But now, in that same silence, there was absence. And not just absence, but awareness of it. Claire had stopped wearing the perfume. He noticed it by the third morning. He hadn't been looking for it, hadn't expected it. But as he passed her desk and the air remained scentless, neutral, his chest tightened. It wasn't a dramatic change. Everything else was the same. She still brought the reports on time, still took meeting notes with quiet accuracy, still greeted him with that soft, steady voice. But something essential had gone missing, and that small absence rang louder than any presence could have. By Friday, he found himself reaching for meaning in the mundane. He lingered by the espresso machine longer than usual, as if proximity to the hallway might offer something unspoken. He stood by his office window, eyes drifting not toward the skyline, but toward her reflection in the polished surface of the conference room wall. Each morning felt slightly longer, slightly heavier, like a song missing one familiar note. Delilah showed up that afternoon. She didn't call, first she never did. She just swept into the lobby of Whitaker Medical Holdings with her usual breezy confidence. Long curls tucked under a paint-speckled scarf, canvas tote swinging at her hip. "Your secretary said you're free for 20 minutes, she said, stepping into his office before he could protest. "I'm not," he muttered. "You are now?" She plopped down in the guest chair, kicked off her shoes, and sighed like she owned the room. Jonathan tried not to smile. Failed? Delilah was younger by 6 years, louder by 100 decibels, and utterly uninterested in his need for order. She glanced around the office, then narrowed her eyes. "You look like you just lost something." "I didn't." "No," she said, tilting her head. "More like, you lost something you never actually had." He paused. Delilah leaned forward. "There's a hollow around you." John. It wasn't there before. He picked up a pen, set it down again. Have you ever considered, she continued, gently now, that maybe grief has started disguising itself as something else? I don't have time for cryptic today. You never have time for anything that makes you feel. She smiled, not unkindly, but it's okay to miss something, even if it wasn't yours yet. She stood up, walked to the shelf where a small framed photo of Elizabeth sat. The photo had been there for years, unmoved. Elizabeth, smiling softly, seated on a bench at their old home in Beaufort, her hair caught mid-motion by wind. She used to wear something, Delilah said quietly, tapping the glass. A scent, lavender and something else would. Maybe Jonathan froze. Delilah turned. I smelled it recently. In the hallway. Thought it was her for half a second. He said nothing, just stared. She'd put it on before gallery shows. Delilah added, said it made her feel visible. Jonathan's mouth went dry. He hadn't remembered the scent until now, not truly. But hearing it out loud, it returned with startling clarity. It was the same perfume Claire had worn that day in the boardroom, the same warmth, the same sweetness, the same ache. After Delilah left, Jonathan sat at his desk long after sunset. The city outside was wrapped in dusk, streetlights flickering on, one by one, like hesitant confessions. His office, once bright and structured, felt cavernous. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, a drawer he rarely touched. Inside was a small leather photo album Elizabeth had left behind, its pages worn, corners frayed. He hadn't looked through it in years. Near the middle, he found a photo he barely remembered. Elizabeth standing in their garden, hair swept back, laughing at something off camera. In her hand was a small bottle of perfume, rounded edges, frosted glass, a label worn thin. He ran his thumb over the image. It wasn't grief that struck him. It was recognition. The scent hadn't haunted him because it reminded him of what he'd lost. It haunted him because it reminded him that he could still feel, still respond, still want. He closed the album, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the ache settle without trying to fix it. It wasn't Elizabeth he missed. It was the chance he'd been avoiding, the chance to choose again, to see what was right in front of him, and the terrifying risk of ruining it. He realized it wasn't grief that was haunting him anymore. It was the chance to love again, and the fear of ruining it. Claire had always loved Thanksgiving, not for the food or the gatherings, but for the pause it offered, a sanctioned moment to step outside of time. Growing up, it had been her mother's favorite holiday. No gifts, no noise, just warmth, tablecloths with small iron burns, and stories passed between plates. Now, Thanksgiving loomed like a finish line she hadn't meant to mark. She had circled the date in her planner with a simple note beneath my last day. No fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet end to something that had once been steady, then uncertain, then too full to hold. The letter had taken her 3 nights to write. She didn't type it, didn't draft it on her phone. She chose a pen, blue ink, not black, and a sheet of ivory stationery from a set she'd never used. The pages were lined, delicate, a small embossed C in the corner. She kept it simple. No confessions, no demands, just a truth. I once changed my scent to be seen, but what I didn't expect was how much I'd feel seen by you, not because of it, but in spite of everything. Thank you for that. Even if you never say anything, even if we pretend nothing ever stirred, I'll still carry the weight of being almost chosen. She signed only her first name, folded the letter carefully, sealed it in a cream envelope, and placed it inside her desk drawer at the office. Not the top drawer, the middle one, beside a forgotten stapler and a worn-out charging cord. It was meant for Jonathan, but not now, later, after she was gone. The days leading up to the holiday moved like thick syrup. She still brought him coffee. He still thanked her with a nod. The closeness they once hovered near had calcified into a familiar form of distance. Not harsh, not angry, just resolved. Except it wasn't, not really. Each time she walked into his office, the air felt heavier. Like the unsaid was pressing on the windows, the walls, the spine of every spreadsheet between them. One evening, after work, Claire drove out to the hospice center where she had started volunteering again. It was quiet there, always. The kind of quiet that didn't need filling. She sat with Mr. Langston, a former math teacher whose mind was slowly unraveling, but whose voice still held warmth. His breathing was shallow that night. The nurse had said he probably wouldn't last the weekend. Claire held his hand. Read him a chapter from a mystery novel he'd liked. When she paused, he turned to her not with recognition, but with clarity. "You look like someone who's waiting," he said, eyes sharp for just a flicker. For what she asked, surprised, he smiled. "You'll know." Then he whispered it, barely audible over the hum of the oxygen tank. "Don't wait too long to choose love." And just like that, he drifted back into sleep. Claire sat there long after the monitor settled into its steady rhythm again. His words echoed not because they were profound, but because they landed in the exact spot she'd been avoiding. She wasn't running from Jonathan. She was running from herself, from the part of her that did want something more, that did feel alive when he looked at her, that did want to be chosen not out of loneliness, but because she had something to give, and maybe because she hoped he still had something to give, too. The next morning, she arrived early to the office, earlier than usual. The streets were still quiet, lit by the soft pink of a Charleston dawn. She walked to her desk with calm certainty, opened the drawer, took out the letter. Her hand hovered over it. She hesitated, then closed the drawer again. At noon, she passed Jonathan's office and paused. The blinds were half closed, but she could still see him sitting alone, back straight, shoulders curved inward just slightly. He wasn't working, just sitting, looking out the window. It had started raining soft, persistent, not yet a storm, and he looked still, not composed, not confident, just human and tired. Claire stood there, invisible in the hallway, holding the letter in her hand. The edges had softened from being pressed against her wallet for too long. She looked down at the envelope, then back at him. She thought about all the ways this could go, all the versions of his silence, of his kindness, of his inability to step forward. Then, slowly, she folded the letter in half. The last place he expected to find her was the old stairwell. But there she stood, in silence, holding the scent he thought he'd forgotten. It was nearly 6:30 when Jonathan decided not to take the elevator. The hallway outside his office was dim and still, the kind of stillness that comes not with peace, but with delay, people waiting out the last 10 minutes before going home, waiting for the moment they could close their laptops and switch off their smiles. He usually avoided the stairwell. It reminded him of late nights and bad news, of the phone call that told him Elizabeth was gone, of the steps he took, alone, back to his car in the rain. But that evening, the elevator felt sterile, too easy, too automated. He needed the echo of his shoes against concrete. The stairwell was cold, the air marked by faint mildew and paint that had begun to peel at the corners. A narrow window on the landing let in the last blush of daylight. Dust swirled lazily in the amber light. And there, half a flight down, framed by fading gold and quiet, stood Claire. She wasn't moving, just standing. In her hands was a small bottle, frosted glass, the same one from that day in the boardroom. The one that had followed him silently, scentless but unmistakable. She looked up as he entered. Neither of them said a word for several seconds. The silence wasn't tense, it was suspended, like a breath neither had released since autumn began. The bottle caught the light, and he saw her thumb move gently over the label. She didn't look away, she didn't smile, she just spoke, voice low. "Even I came to say goodbye." Jonathan's throat tightened. The sound of it, the word goodbye, was too definite, too clean for the mess inside him. He descended one more step, his hand gripped the railing, and then, quietly, Are you leaving because of me? He didn't mean for the words to sound wounded, but they did. Claire didn't flinch. She looked at the bottle, twisted the cap slowly, didn't spray it, just let the scent lift as the wind stirred from the cracked window above. The fragrance lavender, white flowers, and something warmer, deeper hung between them. Then she said it, I'm leaving because I don't know how to stay, and not fall. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled. Jonathan felt the stairwell tilt around him, not physically, but in the way gravity shifts when a moment becomes irreversible. He stepped down one more stair, now only 2 feet from her, and this time, he didn't hide behind silence or logic. He just said, then fall, but don't go. Claire's eyes filled only slightly, not with tears, but with that shine people get when they've been holding their breath for too long. She didn't answer right away, didn't reach for him, didn't step back. Instead, she closed the bottle, slid it into the pocket of her coat, and leaned gently against the railing. The scent lingered in the air. It wasn't overpowering. It was present. He stood beside her, close enough to feel the quiet heat between them. Not touching, but near. No one spoke. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The wind moved again. The bottle clinked softly against her keys in her pocket, and for the first time since this strange, slow unraveling began, Jonathan felt the silence settle rather than stretch. He realized then it wasn't just the scent that had haunted him. It was the possibility, the door he never let himself open, the voice he'd silenced in the name of structure, grief, self-preservation. Claire turned slightly, just enough to see his face in profile. There was something different in it now. Not a solution, not a plan, just a presence, just him. And in that pause between words, between choices, between past and whatever came next, she stayed, didn't move, didn't speak, but she stayed. She didn't promise to stay, but she also didn't leave. The door wasn't locked. He had left it that way for her, for a choice. The sky over the Ashley River had turned to pewter by early evening, low clouds holding on to the last of the day's warmth before surrendering to the night. Jonathan stood at the threshold of the old library room, the one Elizabeth used to call the breathing room. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. The scent of aged paper and oak still lingered, like a memory that refused to fade. It had been years since he lit a fire in the hearth, but tonight, he did. Not because it was cold, but because he needed warmth to fill the spaces words could not. On the coffee table, just off-center beside a stack of untouched medical journals, he placed a small cream-colored card. The handwriting was his, neat, deliberate, slanted slightly, the way Claire had once commented on in passing. If you're still near, I'd like to talk. No pressure. He didn't know if she'd come. He just knew he wouldn't lock the door. Down the hall. The foyer light spilled onto the porch. The door was unlatched. A soft wind moved the edge of the welcome mat. The house, old as it was, creaked gently timber, remembering footsteps long gone. Jonathan settled into one of the 2 armchairs facing the fire. He poured himself a modest glass of scotch and let the glass warm in his palm. The flicker of the flames danced across the floor, catching on the spines of books and the corners of old picture frames. Time passed. He didn't check his watch, didn't pace, just waited. The sound, when it came, was almost imperceptible. A soft click, then the hush of the door opening. He didn't turn to look, didn't rise. Instead, he kept his eyes on the fire as footsteps familiar now in their rhythm moved through the hallway. Then stopped, and there she was, Claire, no coat, just a soft gray sweater and the faint shimmer of rain in her hair. Her eyes met his, not with surprise or hesitation, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who had made a decision. She saw the card on the table, didn't reach for it, just nodded, then slowly sat across from him in the second chair. The room held its breath. The fire cracked once. Rain tapped lightly against the window panes, and neither of them said anything for a long while. Claire looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. The flickering light caught the edge of a silver ring on her pinky one she never used to wear. Jonathan watched her in silence. Then gently, he placed his hand, palm up, between them resting on the armrest that separated their chairs. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was just there. An invitation. She hesitated, but only for a moment, then reached forward and placed her hand lightly in his. His fingers curled not tightly, but with quiet certainty. And for a few minutes, they sat like that. Two people, not fixing anything, not explaining, just being. The scent rose softly between them, familiar now. Lavender, white blossoms, vanilla, and something deeper. Maybe cedar, maybe memory. It didn't overwhelm. It belonged. Jonathan finally spoke, voice lower than usual, almost reverent. If you stay, he paused. Looked down at their joined hands. I won't ask you to leave again. It wasn't a promise made from fear. It wasn't a declaration. Just truth. Offered gently. Held like something precious and fragile. Claire's thumb moved slightly across his knuckle. Her eyes stayed on the fire, but her voice came soft, near a whisper. Then maybe, I'll stay a little longer. They didn't kiss, didn't move closer. They didn't need to. In the old library room, once sacred to grief, a new silence settled, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of beginning again. The late spring air drifted in through the open windows, carrying with it the faint aroma of salt from the Ashley River, a whisper of jasmine from the garden, and something softer, still familiar and warm. Claire stood barefoot in Jonathan's kitchen, humming softly to herself as she sliced carrots into quiet, even coins. The sleeves of her linen blouse were rolled up, and a gentle breeze lifted the ends of her hair. Jonathan was at the stove, stirring something that simmered slowly in a deep pot. Tomato and thyme. A little too much garlic, maybe, but she liked it that way. Their movements were quiet, easy, no orchestration, no need to narrate what came next. They had found a rhythm that asked for no performance, just presence. 6 months had passed since that night in the library room. Not all at once, not in some sweeping cinematic shift, but in the way time moves when people choose to stay slow, certain, deliberate. Claire still worked part-time at the hospice center. She'd taken a more official role there, part advocate, part care coordinator, and found herself loving the stillness it demanded. The gentleness of days measured not in hours, but in how people were held through them. But every afternoon, around 4, she returned to Whitaker Holdings, not as an assistant, not anymore. She had become something else. Jonathan called her strategic advisor on people and culture, a title he half invented, half meant. But really, she was a bridge between departments, between stories, between the stiff spaces of corporate life and the human hearts within them. She didn't need the job, but she loved the quiet way it kept her near. They lived separately, still. She had her apartment by Colonial Lake, and he had the house by the river. But most nights, they chose not to be apart. Sometimes, it was her place, easier commute, smaller kitchen. Sometimes his books and fireplaces and the view of the marsh that she swore made her sleep better. They didn't label it, didn't rush it. They simply showed up for each other, again and again. And somehow, that was more romantic than any vow she'd ever heard. Did I overcook these? Jonathan asked, lifting a spoonful of risotto and offering it across the counter. Claire leaned in, tasted carefully, and smiled, still too polite with the salt. She teased, "But your stirring's gotten better." He chuckled softly, that rare, private kind of laugh she'd come to cherish. She leaned against the counter, watching him with a kind of affection that came not from longing, but from recognition. They weren't trying to fix each other. They were simply choosing to be there. The scent of her perfume faint, floral, grounded, wafted through the room as the evening deepened. She didn't wear it every day anymore, just when it felt right. Tonight, it did. The window beside the kitchen table was cracked open. The lace curtain danced gently in the breeze. The last of the golden light warmed the hardwood floor. And somewhere between the simmering pot and the quiet sounds of two people making dinner, Jonathan said it. I never thought I'd fall in love again. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was still stirring, still watching the risotto absorb its final bits of broth. Then he added, a soft smile tugging at his mouth, especially not because of perfume. Claire laughed genuinely, belly deep. She walked over to him and bumped his shoulder with hers, playfully, then stayed close. He set the spoon down, wiped his hands, and turned to face her fully. For a moment, they didn't speak. The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the stove and the birds beginning their dusk songs outside. Then Claire reached for his hand, as she had 6 months ago, and pressed it gently. I didn't fall because of you, she said quietly. I fell because I finally stopped standing guard. Jonathan's eyes softened. He nodded, once, not in agreement, but in understanding. After dinner, they sat in the den with the windows wide open. The lights were dim. A record played low in the background, something old and crackling, with a melody that didn't ask for attention. Claire curled her feet beneath her, wrapped in the same soft throw Elizabeth used to favor. Jonathan sat beside her, reading a newspaper, but not really reading it. Every so often, their arms would brush. They didn't rush to fill the silence. It had become, at last, their friend. Outside, the wind carried the scent of gardenias from the neighbor's porch. Inside, her perfume lavender, jasmine, and a faint trace of amber settled into the air. But now, it no longer reminded Jonathan of what he'd lost. It reminded him of what he'd chosen, of what had chosen him, of what had stayed. Love, he had learned, doesn't always arrive with declarations and crescendos. Sometimes, it moves through the room like scent, subtle, quiet, almost invisible, but it lingers. If you let it, if you open the windows, if you breathe it in without fear, the scent of jasmine and amber still lingered in the air, but now, it smelled like belonging. Sometimes, love doesn't come in grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it arrives quietly through a scent, a shared silence, or the way someone remembers how you take your coffee. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always look dramatic. It can be slow, messy, uncertain, and yet, the most profound changes often begin with the smallest shifts: a new perfume, a soft gaze, a hand not pulled away. It also teaches us that no one is ever too old or too broken to feel again. Grief may never fully leave us, but it doesn't mean we stop living. It doesn't mean we stop loving. To truly connect with someone, we must risk being seen, not as perfect, not as whole, but as real. So, if your heart still aches from something lost, or if you've been too afraid to let someone in, perhaps now is the time to open the window, just a little. Let the air in. Let the scent of possibility stir something again. Because sometimes, love doesn't knock. It simply lingers, waiting for you to notice it. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart even in a quiet way, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, connect, and inspire. We're grateful to have you here.